Welcome back, folks, to the next edition of Black Hoodie Alchemy. I am Anthony Tyler, and for everyone listening as this releases, happy holiday season to you. If you're listening in America, happy Thanksgiving season to you in specific. I'm sitting here with the homie Martin Ferretti of the Alchemical Mind podcast and many other things, but he hasn't released an episode over there too much this year, but there's a whole lot in the back catalog. So Martin's a wealth of info.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, thank you for all the stuff you've done. Especially Martin editing my book Hunt Manual. Very appreciative of that as well. And before we get into this, we're going to talk about Carl Jung and his red and black books. Especially, we'll get into plenty of both, but I'm particularly interested in the black books because I haven't had the chance to read those yet. They're still pretty new. They're still pretty scholastic. So unless if anyone listening out there has their own PDF copy they want to share with me, please do. But as far as I know, even the digital copies are pretty locked down just because it's so new. And Martin has poured through the black books. So we're going to get into that. I'm really excited for an alchemical chat that's just steeped in esotericism. But real quick, I thought I'd give a quick shout out to our mutual acquaintance, R.N. Voot. He came out with his latest book, Searching for Osiris. I haven't read it yet. He will at some point either. Yeah, we'll definitely get him on the podcast at some point. He's a fun guy. I've read some of his other work, and some of that work has been recommended by Graham Hancock. So there's a name that you could put in your pipe. And I was thinking about it recently. I remember at the beginning of the series, I was talking about live shows eventually. So I figured I'd update anyone that had that stuck in their craw. I'm just supplanting my roots a bit. We'll get to live shows at some point, but right now we're just we're having fun with it and seeing where it goes. And there's going to be probably some Patreon stuff at some point, but for now, just divemind.net. If you like the show, feel free to rate and review it, and that does help a little bit. And that's pretty much it. We'll have got a lot more guests coming up. Some people that we've seen, some people we haven't heard from before, and we'll eventually get some ladies on here too. There are some ladies that would be happy to be on the show. It's kind of been first come, first serve in a way. And I wanted to get all the homies on first, all of my most well-researched and homies that I love to talk with the most. And Martin is definitely up there. So without further ado, let's get into it. Martin, how you been lately, man?
I'm good, man. I just ordered the book, Searching for Osiris.
Oh,
as you were doing your intro.
Excellent.
Yeah, I love R.N. Voot. He's an awesome dude. So got to support him.
Absolutely. And so in terms of Carl Jung, enigmatic to say the least, and we're definitely going to, I can already assure everyone, we're going to go over the hour slot at the Fringe FM. This is going to be a lengthier chat. And where should we begin, Martin? Because I know enough to be able to have this conversation with you, but I would wager that you know more than me, especially without a doubt about the black books. So, this is it's autobiographical, but it's not a day-to-day walkthrough of Jung's experiences. It's autobiographical of the visionary states and the existential crises that he went through, and the dreams and the I guess just as the easiest umbrella term, the visionary states and everything he did. He practiced automatic writing. He delved into the synchronicities that he experienced in his life. He did meditations and things like that. And he had this sort of dive into his psyche. And in many cases, it was a wrestling with his psyche. And he came to know aspects of his psyche that probably we're certainly autonomous, just like aspects of all of our psyches. And Jung's search and his own investigations really bring us to like the thresholds of, I don't know, just existentialism as we know it. He really took it to the outer limits.
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, the black books are amazing. If you've never had a chance to read them, highly recommend it. You can find PDFs. I would recommend finding physical copies of the books. It's like a 7 book volume. The first 6 are kind of all the same size. The 7th one is bigger because he wrote in a bigger book, and these are like facsimile editions, right? So they're um, not reproduction. Well, I guess they're reproductions. They're like photocopied versions of the journals, right?
Right.
So if you get that particular edition, you get like his writing, like in his handwriting, right, with all his little sketches and paintings in there. You get it in the German, and then
Wow.
afterwards you have the English translation. So there's 7 volumes altogether.
Real quick, that's good to
Yeah,
clarify that there are PDFs out there. I will admit, now that I think about it, it's been a minute since I actually did some digging, but I know that I looked within a few months of it coming out. And I don't know, if you know the right places, you could probably find anything, but I could not find that thing. So I'm going to have to get back on that search and really tear into that
yeah.
works.
It's hard to like find a good PDF of it. I do recommend the actual book, right? Especially if you're interested in Jung.
Yeah.
Have you read the Red Book?
Yes.
Okay. So, I mean, if you read the Red Book, you kind of have a basic gist of what goes on in the Black Book. The Red Book is kind of like the final draft of the first 2-ish books in the Black Book, maybe into the third. So you get some idea. Things do get a little bit crazier as you get on. Particularly like books 5 and 7, you have a lot of stuff about talking to dead people and why. The prayer to the dead. You have this whole thing with kind of Jung becoming a Jesus figure, a Christ figure in book 7. So there's a lot going on in there that you don't get in the Red Book, and that's why it was so hard to find. I mean, impossible to find for decades, right? Because the family didn't want the book getting out because they thought that Jung had lost it. In a way, he did, and that's kind of the
Hmm.
point of the Black Books and the Red Book, is that you kind of have to lose yourself in yourself in order to find your true self. And but the physical copies are they're beautiful. They're like, black leather bound. They come in a slipcase. You can get them on Amazon. Christmas is coming up. You got to celebrate the ho ho ho. So you can get them on there. It's like a couple $100, so it's not cheap. But again, if Jung is your jam, then it's well worth it, I would say. And yeah, it's really interesting, man. I think the whole story of it, not just the 18 or 20 years he spent writing in these journals, but like the story of how it all came about is pretty interesting.
To contextualize briefly, I went back and looked it up last night, and to refresh my memory, the Red Books were not released by Jung's family until 2000, or the Red Book, and the Black Book's not released until 2020. So
Yeah.
they definitely held on to this for quite a while, and I think it was Jung's wishes that they held on to it um, until after he died. And if, as I understand it, I could be wrong, but he um, had full intention of releasing the Red Book eventually, and I don't think that there was ever specific intention by Jung himself to release the Black Books. Do you know if that's correct?
I believe that is correct. Yes.
So, and also a fun parallel. Before I forget, I mentioned this, and I believe it was episode 4. It was Alchemy as adaptation. Dr. Seuss has those midnight paintings, and I really like the parallels. Seuss being such a visual, symbolic artist. If you haven't heard of those and poured through those paintings, it was the paintings often that he made at sort of the witching hour, and the paintings that he never showed anyone or didn't release to the public until he died. And it was a similar sort of estate thing to Jung, and you can really see it's pretty dark and psychedelic and oftentimes horrifying. It's a very different Dr. Seuss. And I think it shows that not only is it something that should be done, but it's something that is so often done, whether it's shown, like
Yeah,
whether it's expressed publicly or not, you know?
I think what's interesting is kind of the process, right? And ultimately that's kind of what Jung deals with in the black books and the red books and his later work. 'Cause, I mean, Jung gets to some crazy stuff, right? Like he wrote a UFO book, right? So,
Hmm.
um, his thinking on this is that all this stuff kind of resides elsewhere, right? And your connection through that is the subconscious. And it's interesting you mentioning Dr. Seuss. I was thinking of like Tolkien, for example,
Mm.
because there's a lot of similarities, I think, between the three and the writing process, where a lot of times when you have a, we'll say fiction in quotes, writer, they go through this process where they have an idea and they sketch it out, they outline, they do a draft, they do a second draft, they peer review, there's an editor, all this stuff, um, and until you get to a final product. Whereas with Jung and Tolkien, for example, pretty much said it outright, where it wasn't like he was writing a story about elves and hobbits and that, but that he was kind of transplanted into this other world, right?
Hmm.
That was just as real as the world that you and I are living in. Um, Now, obviously, you know my position on that, right? How real is the world that we're living in? Probably not very much,
Right.
but I
True.
think these guys really said it in their through their works, right? Um, because they really did tap into something completely different, and the methodology that Jung uses is very alchemical. So we can definitely draw some comparisons between what you see in the Red Book and guys like Paracelsus, for example, just veiled in a newer, more modern language, I guess. And I think that's true, really, of of a lot of mythology. Not all of it, but a lot of mythology, because there are these like archetypes that live in it, and you and I always talk about this archetype stuff. Um, I think that's particularly true of a book like this.
Yeah. And I don't know if I've really ever heard anyone else say this, but I feel like it's just glaringly true. I feel Jung was very proto chaos magical. It seems
Mm,
in many ways, granted, Jung was much more traditional, but he approached things in unorthodox ways. And there's not a terrible amount of difference between, at least in my mind, between what people like Grant Morrison and even Alan Moore did with their chaos magic work through comic books. And there's some sort of, I don't know, maybe I'm stabbing in the dark here, but there's something intensely meta about the idea of using art to become more self-aware through your art. And it's the facets of that start to get a little mind-bending if you take chaos magic into account. And I don't know, I don't really know how far that goes, but that seemed to be the same kind of process, that of that self-awareness through your art. And in a way, how self-aware does your art then become, I guess?
yeah, no, that's actually really interesting. You bring that up because Jung really wrestled a lot with this in book one, where he's kind of in this weird existential place, doesn't know what he's going to do with himself. And because of the experiences that he starts to have as a result of his work, he can't figure out whether he's a scientist or an artist or if there's something else going on. Um, and that's something that he wrestles with throughout his career, I would say.
Yeah.
And and it's really interesting to see that because guys like Morrison, as we've talked about, they don't really see that distinction. They've kind of embraced it. But of course, they have decades of psychology behind them, right?
Hmm.
Between Jung and other guys, where they can kind of draw upon some of that stuff. Whereas Jung doesn't really have that, right? That's why the work is kind of seminal in that, yes, there's similarities to previous things, but he approaches it in a different way, right? It's like this whole cyclical mythology that a lot of people discuss, where for example, the archetype of the Christ is not a new archetype, right? It kind of gets told and retold as society and culture progresses. And it's the same with any of these ideas, right? Um, the act of active imagination that Jung used to create all this work is not necessarily new to Jung. I'm sure you have a lot of Buddhists in the audience, and you know, some consider Buddha like the father of psychology, right?
Hmm.
Whereas we're talking, thousands of years in the past. Um, but a lot of the ideas remain the same throughout, the Middle Ages, when you start seeing a lot of the alchemical works being coming around. Um, Post Enlightenment, some of that stuff has a resurgence, and then obviously into the 20th century. And it's kind of one of these things where you have to have almost the right set of circumstances in order for this kind of stuff to happen, right? So, excuse me, I'm trying to still getting over this little cold thing that I had, flu, whatever.
Yeah, it was rough.
Um,
I had the same thing. It was terrible.
yeah, it was pretty rough. So when Jung started doing his exercises, we'll say, was 1912, early 19 teens, right? So this was pretty much soon after he got into this huge fight with Freud. That whole thing is quite interesting, and I think rather telling of the ways that psychology evolved in
Hmm.
two divergent paths. One following Freud and one following Jung, and just general like world garbage going on, right? So you're talking about the start of World War One, which coincidentally also inspired guys like Tolkien to write his books, right?
Hmm.
A lot of that is based on him being in the trenches during the war and seeing some of the horrors of this new form of conflict that humanity had never seen before, right? Like we've always had wars, but not to the extent of what we saw in World War One with chemical weapons and things like that being created. A lot of the stuff that we consider like modern military technology emerged first during World War One. And back then it was probably even worse because there weren't some of the international laws and treaties that prevented people from doing some of the things that they did during that era. And so, Jung is seeing this kind of thing where his friend basically just ousts him, right? And then used the classic phrase of, "Well, it's because he's a Jew." So that kind of hurt Jung quite a bit. He's seeing all this turmoil across the world, and he feels like humanity is better than the situation that it's in, and he wants to find out why we're in this situation, but also how he can help make that situation better. So a lot of the work from the Black Books is really trying to do kind of this like personal individuation work. Um, I know you just had Miguel and Vance on, and I love those guys. I love that you had him on because I've been
Uh,
listening to them for 10 plus years probably.
yeah,
And
yeah, those guys are great. Shout out to
yeah,
them.
yeah, shut out. But yeah, Vance was talking a lot about individuation, and that's one of the key pieces of work from Jung. So you have this personal work, and then you have this like collective methodology for like bettering the race, right? And race, I mean like the human race, all of humanity,
Hmm.
and how we can do that. And and one of the things he comes up with, I don't know, maybe because of this whole thing with war, but there's some other maybe darker tones to this, is kind of humanity's loss of self, of being in touch with itself as a collective, of kind of throwing aside ritual and reverence for elders and for people that had come before. And again, like the deeper you go into the books, that the more you see this. So I'm pretty sure it's book 5 that's basically mostly devoted to him like conjuring dead spirits, right? and coming up with this incantation to kind of appeal to the dead, so that he becomes basically like their personal Jesus, right?
Is that
He
is that the Seven Sermons of the Dead? Is that where that's
so
from?
so it's not the seven sermons; it's the prayers to the dead.
Okay.
But a lot of that work, yes, is turns out in the seven sermons,
Okay.
which the seven sermons is amazing, right?
Yeah.
Just the way that it's written just seems like one of these like old timey, like, New Testament things that you read, I guess.
Yeah.
It's quite spot on, and you actually see that quite a bit in both the Black Books and the Red Book, where Jung kind of imitates a lot of the way that things are told in the Bible, because he's trying to not quite like create a new religion, but kind of get in touch with the core of what made Christianity, if that
Right.
makes sense. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why Gnostics really, like modern Gnostics, really love Jung, in that he can kind of dissect what's wrong with whatever Christianity has evolved into, versus the things that are actually found, within Scripture. Both canonical and non-canonical, right?
Hmm.
So I think that whole thing is rather interesting, and some of it is like super obvious. So if you read the prayer, there's sections on there like he basically invites the dead to like listen to him and like eat of his body and drink his blood, right? So that's obviously like a very Christian metaphor,
Hmm.
but it's a lot more than that, right? So if you tell a Christian like, oh yeah, eat of my body, or whatever the saying is, eat of my flesh, drink of my blood, to most Christians that might not mean anything, right? It's like, oh yeah, it's like it's Jesus time, right? I'm gonna go get my wafer, so I'm gonna eat the flesh and drink of the blood, right? The bread and the wine,
Hmm.
which the whole thing in itself is like this giant alchemical ceremony that no one pays any mind to, right? And this is kind of the point that Jung is trying to make, in inviting the dead and in speaking with, Philemon and various deities throughout the text. When Salome shows up, it's not kind of to he's not actually like speaking to these entities as if they were real entities that came back, um, but they kind of encompass these like archetypes that we're all very familiar with, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so what he wants to do is kind of get back to basics. Like, what does this mean, and how do I get the meaning to make sense? Um, and so that goes back to this active imagination thing. Uh, a lot of people confuse some of the stuff that Jung was doing. You mentioned like automatic writing. Like, yes, all this kind of is happening. But he does have like his wife helping him write stuff down, right? He's got an assistant that writes stuff down, and he's not like completely unconscious, right? It's not like he dropped 10 grams of mushrooms and like somebody's videotaping him and taking notes on everything he's mumbling. He's very aware of the experiences that he's going through, um, but at the same time not controlling the experience, right? So this is why it's called active imagination. It's not like, what's the I should know this because I do this all the time. It's like hypnagogia, right? Where you get to a state in between wakefulness and sleep. He does experiment with hypnagogia quite a bit, but
Yeah.
active imagination is a little bit more, because with hypnagogia, like you do have this like control of the dream because you're not fully asleep, right? So you have that control and you can create the world. Um, but active imagination is more like, um, letting go of that control. It's like being fully asleep, but not asleep, right? So he's not controlling the things that he sees. He just lets things come and he just experiences those things as if they were actually occurring to him.
Yeah, which is essentially the state the mystical trance state in general.
Correct.
Yeah, that's I've gone through my process on the podcast as well as in my books, but that is essentially what I do. Joe Roop would call that transcendental magic. You know, there's different
Yes.
ways that you could explain it. Mysticism is usually the best way, the quickest way I explain it, but just the simple act of using psychological spiritual primers to get into that trance state where you're able to, because obviously I think it goes without saying, especially by now, on episode 27 or so, there's nothing physically manifesting in front of you. These are trance states, and you're sort of working your way up to, because you can't just dive right in. You have to work your way up to the workbench of your psyche, and then you sort of, once you get into that trance state, you use the primers to get you to the place you want, and then you just let it go and you watch how it unfolds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So you're actively participating in the dream. But it's so weird to explain, right? Because we don't have the
Yeah.
words. And I was thinking about this. When you told me you wanted to have this discussion, I was like, oh man, like I haven't read these things in like a year, right? But some of that stuff just sticks with you, right?
Yeah.
Like Jung's work sticks with you. Like if you get it, you get it. And I'm thinking about it. I'm like, man, like what am I going to talk about? Like how do you have discussions on journals, right?
Right.
If you've had the experience that Jung experiences, um, it's probably easier to explain than, you said you were going to go over an hour. I'm thinking we need to record for like 8 hours, right?
No kidding. Yeah.
Because like this is one of those topics. Because
that's why you don't see a whole lot of conversations about this in general, because it's dense and it's hard to work your way through. But it's a lot of fun to talk about and listen to. But it's just, where do you start and how do you categorize it and how do you even analyze it?
Well, you know what it is? So again, like this takes place over 20 years, right?
Mhm.
So impossible to explain 20 years of experience in an hour.
Yeah.
But not just that, like think about the level of understanding you have to have on so many different topics in order to kind of make sense of what's going on, right? It's kind of like, the mystery religions, right?
Mhm.
You can tell somebody what something is, but for them to experience it and see it for themselves and live it as if it were their own experience is a completely different thing. And when you get, the thing about Jung's Black books is once you start reading it, you're in that experience, right? Joe would love this. I don't know if Joe has read the Black books, but if he hasn't, he needs to.
Yeah, I'm not
Because
sure.
it's like living, breathing magic, right? Where it's not just like you're reading a good book and you're like in this world, right? And making yourself a part of it. It's like you're experiencing this thing as Jung experiences, right? Because again, none of this is happening consciously for him, right? And one of the things he talks about a great deal about when he tries to analyze these experiences is how difficult it is for people to remove the conscious experience from the subconscious, and how a lot of times people are so deeply afraid of going and doing any kind of work, like shadow work is usually the term that's used, any kind of work with the subconscious, because it's not an everyday experience. And think about it, this is over 100 years ago, right? So now here we are 100 years later. We haven't progressed much for the better, one could argue, in terms of the things that Jung was seeing. In fact, we've gotten much worse. We've gotten more distracted. We spend more time doing less meaningful things, right? And that causes this like almost psychosis in people. Really, it's probably a neurosis. So that this is one of the things that like Freud and Jung were arguing about is kind of the cause of neurosis. Also, a lot of penis talk.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of penis talk in the Black Book too, by the way. But in terms of like the alchemical meaning of it, right? So there's a lot
Right.
of talk of like the virgin and the phallus.
Mhm.
But you know, I think the difference there being that Freud saw this as like a literal physical manifestation of innate trauma, whereas Jung saw it as kind of an expression of archetypes trying to come out into the light. And I think really maybe that's where the discussion is in dealing with something like the Black Books is the magical aspects of it.
Spilling my flask like Mark Anthony. Cleopatra, let's drink to the melody. Where we roam, it's nothing like Italy. Captain Log, Bacardi, rum diary. Intoxicated by the heresy. Mean Hennessy got me twisted, I'm 2 blocks from tiny. The gin scar in my memories. Like that gunshot wound, I presume, on my body. The inevitability will have me confronting the shooter like Pablo or Gandhi. The devil water nearly made a martyr, but I'm happy to announce I'm alive, well and vibing. Getting tanked like my name was Sherman. So drunk that my liver's burning. My child mother stays stressing. Alcohol be a quick suppressant. Need a job like I need a blessing. Improbable that I feel threatened when you're walking like Mel Gibson. Shit, I'm just an ordinary citizen.
Yo, I left a boy but came back a man. The stoic poet could flow at the pace, half for grams. Cocaine and that tan, exchange hand to hand. Cheese stale on my brain like some lame Packer fan. I'm way past the tan, the plague blacker than salt. Most F's in squad lead, baby black is a star. Bar after bar, straight wickedness. Listen this, verbal imagery, phonetic chemistry for listeners. Even the deaf, meaning listeners and visionists. If you know what my mission is, you know you can't imprison it. Fundamental principles, let's split the differences down the middle after you finish scribbling out your inferences. In integers, I do not register. Black's your executioner in the form of your sentence of repentance. Forgiveness is off the table, yo, I'm able, so it shall be written, so it shall be done.
I'm a model citizen, I'm a model citizen, writing novels, drowning my sins in between bottles. I'm a model citizen, I'm a model citizen, writing novels, drowning my sins in between bottles. Metaphors and synonyms, in the them, and them, who Diablo, look within, his heart remains hollow. I'm a model citizen.
Metal monkey on my back, scratch that, pedal junkie pushing tracks, level something, build it back on my sound wave. Robot heart, beating fast, Noah's Ark out of gas. I'm the wrath of the mighty, make the ground break. Son of the sun, cut a Sam, trash the guts. I'm 100 hands, that's a lot of arms, that's what's up. Slap the pastures, crash the faith, pass the buck. Mask and tape like nothing's broken, nothing's broke. Rise above freedom farmers, repeated harmer. My bizarre is bizarre like the far cyanide. Take a chunk from the pie in the sky and night. Catching a winking with the pirate eye. Juggle the planets with my hands, jogging on the green hawk, flying at your beanstalk. Crashing the market, pesticide, fruit to your labor, eaten by the audit. I'm your favorite superhero, sleeping in a comic.
Too full of good vibes to listen to the static. Negative, positive balance is mathematics. Life is the equation, freedom and equality. Ignore the beef and keeping peace is my policy. Takes a bigger man to turn the upper cheek. I know it's true though, these clowns might call a brother weak. I say on that cause they don't know what's really good. Bunch of no-brain cowards ice grilling in the hood. Knowledge reigns supreme over nearly everybody. Knowledge is self, save self from ugly. I close my eyes and meditate on the stars. Levitate to Mars and view the earth from afar. Try to realize a higher state of mind and get there. Breath of fresh air, erase the tension and the stress there. Caress the Buddha's breath and elevate it nightly. Stick to my guns and do the right thing like Spike Lee.
I'm a model citizen, writing novels, drowning my sins in between bottles. I'm a model citizen, I'm a model citizen, writing novels, drowning my sins in between bottles. Metaphors and synonyms, in the them, and them, who Diablo, look within, his heart remains hollow. I'm a model citizen.
Thousands of people are having paranormal experiences with ghosts, demons, shadow people, dogmen, Bigfoot, and more. Their stories need to be told, and they are being told. Dark Waters, the renowned storyteller, invites you to join at IamDarkWaters.com. For just a few dollars a month, you can listen to some of the most hair-raising and compelling stories on the planet. You'll have access to real-life stories told by Dark Waters, thousands of hours of content. Their encounters are being told, and told by the best, at IamDarkWaters.com. Listen to stories like The Rabbit Man, the Dogman encounter in Silas, Alabama, The Man with No Face, The Other Woman, a day ahead of the devil, dogman murder and Hurricane Ida, even a story of someone trying to kill a dogman. Louisiana water demon stories. Sign up today and become a member at IamDarkWaters.com. That's IamDarkWaters.com.
The Natural Born Alchemist podcast is a podcast that covers topics like alchemy, shamanism, psychedelics, anarchism, and philosophy. Join Alex, that's me, and a multitude of guests on a quest to discover the nature of reality, of spirit, and of consciousness. Each episode will also introduce you to new music that you might never have heard before. You can find the podcast on most platforms. Simply search for Natural Born Alchemist or go directly to naturalbornalchemist.com. There you'll be able to find all the social media links as well. Freedom is in the mind.
Musicians experience a lot of frustration with music marketing and promotion. They have no idea how to get their music heard, and they're spending hours sending emails, making phone calls, and hitting up their friends to promote them. With our industry-powered digital marketing platform, we can set up your media plan in minutes. Our team will automatically distribute your music across all the best channels, so you can focus on actually making the music. Submit your music today on our website at mymusicpromoter.com. That's mymusicpromoter.com.
Listen, as we explore the mysteries of the universe, the unknown, high strangeness, consciousness, and our human potential, Lighting the Void is an eclectic program that strives to ignite the late night with stimulating conversations. Join us on The Fringe FM.
Again, he was wrestling with the fact that, he's a scientist, but here he's playing with art, and he's playing with magic, and he's playing with occult forces. And what does that mean, right? Especially as someone who, would have been raised a Christian. I'm sure, a lot of people listening are. I was raised in church, right? My dad was a preacher. A lot of things change when you begin seeing things in a different light. And sometimes you try to reconcile those things. And I think that goes to kind of the Christian overtones of a lot of things, including like maybe taking some things verbatim and then like rephrasing them in this new way of understanding the connection between conscious and unconscious. But really, I think to Jung, even though he never explicitly outright says it in these books, and I've heard him talk about some of these things in interviews. So you can find some pretty good interviews with Jung from his older years, obviously, where he talks about some of these things, and just the level of certainty in which he discusses some of these things, I think is incredible to see, because I think a lot of people, including myself, and we're kind of getting into something before the show, just have a hard time expressing in words. Because it's not an everyday experience. And so when you kind of experience these things and try to bring them out and discuss them publicly, it's very tough to make sense of it. And the main aspect of Jung's work is focusing on the inner before the outer, right?
Yes.
And sometimes you can get into a place where you're like, if I say these things, and this is surely why his family didn't want any of these things to ever come out. If I say these things, people are going to think I'm crazy. And think about someone like Jung, who kind of already had somewhat of an established career in the psychology field, right? Creating basically the field with Freud, at least in the modern sense, and having this existential crisis. Like, what do? Right? It's just like growing up in church, and all of a sudden you have this crisis, and you're like, oh, well, a lot of this is bullshit. What do I do? Right? Because you have to redefine your identity based on the things that you're seeing. And if you can't kind of meld those two things together, is when you have these things that they call like neurosis, right? So anxiety, depression, things like that. And I think we see that a lot in these kind of circles, in esoteric circles, among like the alternative crowd. You see this a lot because we're seeing and experiencing so many things that's kind of very difficult to reconcile, right? And so you try to find people with similar ideas as you, and you try to toss things back and forth with others to see if you can find an answer for yourself. But you kind of realize ultimately none of that really makes any difference because you're only going to find the answer inside yourself. So that's something that Jung really struggles with a lot, and that's why I do recommend reading these things. Like it's beautiful to see the process, not just in the ideas that he comes up with, but in like experiencing some sort of like shared pain, if you will. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's tough to describe.
It is, and it's something that, in ways that aren't too poking and prodding, I've tried to ask guests about in general, and just people's relationship to their own art and research, and how these things have helped them. And the most recent being Keats Ross talking about his haunt manual, and that's definitely the inspiration behind Dive Manual, the book I wrote, the first one. And not that any sort of process is ever really complete, but sort of the beginning of something, the beginning of a process inward of individuation. And I think it's also worth noting, there's far more names. More often than not, if you look at someone, especially someone that has had a long established artistic or scholastic career, if you will, and often the most existential ones, you'll find, these like pivot points where people had this, dark night of the soul, whether they be young or middle aged, sometimes old, but it's usually, with a little bit of vigor left in you that this comes. And I guess for Dante, it would be at the end of his life. But you can see this sort of existential quandary and this sort of almost chaos magical finding your own self-awareness through self-awareness of your art. We can see that with Gautier's fascination and his rendition of Faust. And what else? There were some other names I had in mind. But, we can see this time and again, and there's this almost like a spiritual cocoon where people have to go and incubate these ideas, these radical ideas that they haven't been able to integrate into their lives yet. Yet they're still a part of their experience. And the only way you can seem to do that really is through the analog of art and like mythology, among other things, and poetry. And I mean, especially in the classical sense of like the epic poems and whatnot.
So sometimes you have this just kind of integrated in like a philosophical sense, right? So like the Buddhists have like the Pratyeka Buddhas that kind of achieve enlightenment, but they decide to just, hang out and teach, basically, right? But then sometimes it's like deeply ingrained in a culture. And I think that's a little bit more fascinating to me. I don't know how it is now in modern India. It might be different, but traditionally, you would live your life, right? You would grow up, you would get married, you have kids, and then you get to a certain age where your worth to the society isn't in production, but in kind of being an elder, right? And so you go and you set up a hut in the woods, and people come see you for advice or medicine or whatever, right? The whole concept of the shaman, for example, even though generally that would be one person per village, I find that a little more fascinating, and maybe a little more something a little more in that Jung wants to approach in a way, where we've kind of forgotten where we come from, right? We're so worried about, I have to get up and do this today, and what am I going to do tomorrow and the day after? We never take time to introspect, in retrospect, right? Look inside and look behind us to see, what has changed. Not so much like focusing on what could have I done better, or what could I have done differently, but kind of taking a particular instance and really seeing how that impacts yourself and those around you. Again, the importance of ritual, right? I'm sure a lot of people have rituals, but they might be a little more, less magic, more superstition in a way, right? Like, you have football players or baseball players that like to do a particular dance or like enter into the stadium in a particular way. Like there is something to the ritual, right?
Absolutely.
And whether you believe in a particular religion or not, the one thing that religion is usually pretty good at is the aspect of ritual and creating community. And that's something that Jung sees as lacking in a modern world. I guess maybe kind of being an extension of the whole Nietzsche, God is dead kind of thing, where he doesn't necessarily mean like God is literally dead. God is still out there, but that mankind's connection to divinity and by divinity generally is meant whatever is inside, right? The spark.
Mm-hmm.
That is what has been killed, right? It exists out there. It's never left, but we've kind of just decided to put it by the wayside. And for Jung, the only way for us to reconcile who we are as people is to kind of find that again. And that's like the trope of all tropes, right? Every like deep esoteric form of thought has this idea of the union of opposites.
Mm-hmm.
And Jung kind of plays with it in some sense in a little more literal way, even though these are things that are happening in an imaginal realm, right? Again, not like imagination, like he's making things up, but to him and to me, it's something that exists and is waiting to be tapped into. And by tapping into that is how we can kind of move forward as people and as a culture, as a society.
Are there any particular notes of interest? Because it's sort of, I don't know, it's definitely meta to say the least, and it's also impressive how there's just like the level of actual storytelling that's at work in Jung's journals as well, because he's investigating like the story within his own psyche, essentially. So are there any noteworthy things that have really stuck with you, that sort of like scenes from Jung's inner mythology, if you will?
Yeah, I really like this whole discourse he's got with Salome. Again, playing with this Christian mythology, right? In his version of Salome is blind, so she's unable to see like the connection between the liminal and the subliminal, until basically Jung's beheaded and she regains her sight. And I think that whole story is it's like almost the pinnacle of what Jung is trying to achieve. He goes through this kind of hero's journey, and everyone knows the term the hero's journey. I had to read the book in school, right? Like I'm sure a lot of people have read it that listen to this.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously the hero's journey is not like exclusive to Campbell, right? Like he didn't make it up. He was just the person that put it into like a literally like interpretive sense,
Mm-hmm.
that appealed to a wider audience, where I was like, oh yeah, like that's what this means, right? That's what that's there. But it's not like a new thing, right? It didn't just like pop up when Campbell wrote it. It's in all human mythology throughout history. And Jung kind of tries to assess what that means, right? What is the hero's journey? And you talked about Dante. Like Dante's Inferno is is the story of the hero's journey. It's the story of the Black Books. It's the story of the Odyssey. It's like the epic story of all time, right? And it's not necessarily about, buff hero going out and slaying monsters in the world. It's literally a literal interpretation of the alchemical process of trying to fight the dragon within, right? So what's the dragon? The dragon's the shadow side. And so the hero has to slay the dragon in order to save the virgin and live happily ever after. Well, that's a fun fairy tale, but what does that mean, right? It's not about becoming a prince and saving the princess, right? It's about accepting the urges and desires that you have inside you, and kind of learning to communicate with that, right? One of the later episodes, one of the last ones that I recorded for my podcast, was somewhat to this this kind of story, in that, in order to really unite all aspects of yourself, whether you want to or not, is to slay your monsters, right? To kill who you were at one point and kind of surface in a new way, right? Become a new person, right? So you enter the underworld and you come out the other side a completely different person. You're reborn, right? And sometimes it's like it's hard to talk about these things in a way that don't seem like, hocus pocus, like a new agey kind of thing.
Yeah.
You and I both hate that kind of stuff. Yeah. But really, I think there is something to it, right? The world is literal magic, literal imaginal expression of something beyond, right? And it's just the things that our physical bodies have evolved to kind of see as something that we need in order to survive.
Yeah, our bodies are the temples with which we pay homage to the cosmos.
Absolutely, right? And so there's certain things that you feel don't really make an impact on your survival, and so you kind of avoid these things. And for Jung, you shouldn't avoid them. If the reason that you have issues in your life, according to Jung, is because you avoid dealing with the deep, dark stuff that's inside, right? There's a really good quote in one of the books, and I can't remember which one, but it's something to the effect of, like, you can't be enlightened by imagining figures of light. You have to, like, make the darkness conscious. And I think that's so, like, deep and interesting and important, because a lot of times what a lot of people focus on is the light side of things, right? Like being good and doing good things and helping humanity. And, like, yes, all these things are important, but that's not how you become the hero, right? Everybody does that. So you're just like everybody else. In order to become the hero, you have to learn that the dark side of yourself is just as important as the lighter side. And that's a harder thing to do because, we've grown accustomed as a society to not accept any of the dark aspects of our humanity, right? And you talk a lot about serial killers and cults and things like that, which is why I love listening to your podcast, because you keep it real. You know what I mean? And
Thanks,
yes,
man.
no problem. You and I have slightly different views on evil, right? But I understand, like, where you come from, and I understand where a lot of people come from. But evil.
You have a much more, like, an even further kind of Eastern interpretation than I do. Is that the easiest way to put it for the listeners?
I think that's fair. Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. For me, you can't have good without evil, because then you wouldn't have anything to define good against, right? And so by erasing evil, you have no actual definition of good, and that causes more psychological harm than just wanting to be a good person. And that maybe is kind of a tough pill to swallow for a lot of folks, again, because we're raised in a culture that wants everything to be good. But that's just not the reality of things, right?
Yeah, I guess the difference between you and I is I externalize the concept a little more than you do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I try not to, because to me, there's no point in externalizing, because it's an internal process anyway, right? So, yeah, that's the difference. But, you know, like the way that you view it is the way that I would say a large majority of people view it as well, right? You just feel more comfortable talking about it.
Yeah, and you just sparked a flash in my memory of some stuff I've been looking into recently, and I won't rabbit hole too far, but I think it contributes to the conversation pretty well. You're sort of talking about the inner process of interpreting like the existential quandaries around you, if you will. And I've been looking into this term ethnomethodology that I'd never heard before. Are you familiar with it?
I am not.
So I actually, funny enough, I came across this reading an interview done with Nathan Fielder, which is a Canadian comedian. Some people are probably familiar with his name. He's done like Nathan For You and The Rehearsal, but he's this he's friends with Sacha Baron Cohen, and sort of this performative take on comedy, whether you call it reality comedy or cringe comedy. Like, think what you will of Borat. Sacha Baron Cohen is it's like he went to like clown school. That guy went into the trenches of like, you really wanted to understand the theory and mechanisms of comedy. And he's like a very philosophical guy in general. And so in this interview, the Nathan Fielder does this like kitchen nightmares type thing where he goes into businesses for Comedy Central and he gives them these preposterous ideas to try and drum up business. Like just absolutely preposterous stuff. And the idea is, he said in the interview, his mother says that what he does, if you want to philosophy, you want to like dress it up the most, is ethnomethodology. And it's this study of what's the best way to put it? Like, sociology as we understand it has these set patterns, and that human beings sort of adhere to these set patterns. And it's almost like, it's a sort of clockwork model in a way of understanding the psyche. And ethnomethodology does the exact opposite. It's saying that common sense and the common understandings that we have are something that are a lot more on a case-by-case basis than most people understand. And when you change one thing about that situation, like you propose to someone a very obscure business model, like here's a good example. He convinces this realtor in the LA area to start marketing herself as a ghost realtor, 100% free, or ghost-free homes. And he convinces this psychic to post billboards saying, "Maria Garcia, please call me. I had a vision about you," because he looked it up, and Maria Garcia was one of the most prominent female names in the Los Angeles area. So stuff like that. And like, you change little things about that, and you also become an awkward person, or a cartoonish version of a human that challenges people's views of the norm and their viewpoints on common sense. You get people acting in very different ways, and it's very telling about the things that we not only hold, we take for granted, but the things that we hold very dear about how we process our lives, the rituals and ceremonies of our lives, but not just that, the metrics with which we measure our lives, like time being an interesting angle on this. Because time, obviously, there's an objective level to time that no one is really trying to deny, but the way a human being processes time is a purely subjective thing. And you look at people who are like isolated, or like people who are, doing time in prison, you have to learn to adapt and find new ways of processing, new metrics with which you process time. And in a way, this is sort of the whole process we're talking about, is not so much time specifically, but it's it's an existential radicalization of the self and the individuation process where we suddenly have to find new means of understanding these aspects of ourselves. And yeah, I find that fascinating. Just because I've always been interested, for one, not just in this sort of philosophy, but in that kind of humor as well, where you do something almost prankish, but in, like, you could say what you will about Borat. I actually rewatched it recently.
I love Borat.
Yeah, it's great, man. And you know what? It's it's crazy, but you truly can't deny that Sacha Baron Cohen had some very earnest, genuine political, like, even just damn existential sentiments to be shared. Like, if you take a cartoonishly racist, like, you basically take a cartoonish version of what, white shut-in America thinks of like a foreign reporter, and you just give it to them. You just give it to them, and then you see if they even question it. And they don't. Most of them don't even. And then there's also, the commentary on the anti-Semitism. I mean, very, very artistically and philosophically bold. I mean, the idea of creating an anti-Semitic character, Cohen being very Jewish himself,
right,
to sort of coax out, to give people every he at every turn with the Borat character, he gives people every single opportunity to realize that this can't possibly be real, but they don't. They just bite down the whole time. And that's one of the craziest parts. And that's sort of the psychological, sociological part of comedy like that, but just observations like that in general. I think it's really wild, Jung, the reason the work is so seminal. And I think this kind of strikes to like the heart of what alchemy is we're trying to find the metrics with which to reconcile the opposites, right?
Yeah, for sure. So Jung calls this the what's the German? Hang on, it's Vergedenken, I think it is, or Verdenken. Forethought is usually like the translation for this. But forethought is like a completely different thing. Like, forethought is almost like premonition in a way, I guess. But that's not what Jung sees as forethought. For Jung, it's kind of like the Gnostic pronoia, right? The first thought. For like a more modern audience, it'd be something more akin to like mindfulness, where you're in this like state of sight where like your blinders are taken off, right? That's kind of what forethought is. You're expanding your point of view from this like focused thing that's in front of you to just like everything around you, right? 360.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I think that I think that's just like a whole different experience when you can see things this way, especially if you can do it by removing that conscious element, right? Yeah, and I think like Sacha Baron Cohen does this really well. I don't know if you like watch his really old stuff, but I used to love the Ali G show.
Yeah, I've seen bits. That's one of those
bits?
on my list where I really feel like I need to go and watch the whole thing.
Yeah, they like redid like a later season that it was fine, but it wasn't as good. Like the original like skits were good, where it was like this like white British rapper basically that would interview politicians. And again, like it's obviously a farce, but like people don't know that, right? Because like that's the world that we live in, right? Like everyone is a character, and so you just don't know who's like what's the term in video games, the NPC, non-playable character, right? Like you don't know who's an NPC and who's a real person anymore. So you just assume that everyone's a real person, I guess, right? But that's kind of not how it is, right? You can go into this little like Gnostic matrix thing. That's kind of the similar idea, where like some people are awake in that they know what's happening, and some people are just living their life with their blinders on, without forethought, right? But Jung wants to see a society where everyone has forethought, where everyone has this like connection to the divine spark, and that can kind of, like literally spell out the world, right? By using magic, just not in that terminology, because again, Jung's a scientist, right? So he's got a hard time saying, "Hey, we're doing real magic here, folks," because that's not going to work for established academia, and really for a lot of people that were kind of really into this work because it was revolutionary. The kind of things that early psychology was figuring out about people. Of course, it can go in a very weird direction, and we can talk about that at some other time. The crazy shit that happens as a result of Freud's work, for example, the kind of things that as a society we allowed to happen to others, right. Because of these ideas, and that's true of anything, right? Like even in Nazi Germany, some of those ideas. They didn't come from this sense of like anti-Semitism, but they just kind of got turned and twisted into that kind of thing, and that's just like the general aspect of magic, dude, right? Because like nobody knows what magic is. They just want to do it because they kind of want that sense of power, and it's really dangerous to play with that kind of thing. You can go into some really dark places, and if you don't have the work put in to gain some understanding of what it is that you're experiencing, you're gonna lose your freaking mind, dude. You're gonna lose your mind.
Yeah, there's some interesting lectures that Manly P. Hall gives. You can find them on YouTube. It's like, I believe it's a 4-part series on demonology. And there's one, I think it's 20th century demonology, and it's like psychic ghosts, and I'll have to put him in the show notes, because he goes into a bit like while he's working his way into the meat of the lecture, where he's talking about because he's just been known. And Manly P. Hall, by the way, is another name I was trying to think of to bring up. Another person that went through a very alchemical shut-in sort of process, and emerged something very different. So he, working into the meat of the lecture, he talks about, since he was, just such a well-rounded philosophical guy, he founded this philosophical research society and things. He's obviously a known person to come to amongst his circle, and even just people far and wide, actually. So in some ways, he sort of became an investigator, and he would go and look into people with spiritual maladies and not necessarily try to remedy them, but definitely in some cases try to diagnose and help people find avenues to go down. And he talks about people just going too far down this sort of Crowley-ish left-hand path rabbit hole. I'm about the middle path, and like the left-hand path being sort of the endless rabbit hole inward, and the right-hand path being just the constant being engulfed in the collective, and going too far down that inner rabbit hole sort of begins to just fracture your psyche, and you start to, in the easiest psychological way, you just start to devolve and become more even animalistic, where he talks about, grown men just in states of psychosis, men who were, like disciplined esotericists that he knew. And obviously sometimes just random people that came to him, but like people just losing their minds and like barking like dogs, sort of possession type stuff. And, I always found that really fascinating, because, you can hear some fire and brimstone shit at any, your corner store church. But when you hear people who are scholastic and not trying to be wooey talk about people just genuinely losing their minds because of this, and then giving warnings saying don't dabble lightly, it really makes you think twice.
No, and listen, I've often beat around the bush in a lot of things, right? Because, when I was doing regular episodes, I try to keep things positive. But there is absolutely something to that, dude. I mean, I got to a point where I literally lost everything, right? Like my wife and I almost got divorced. Like, I was essentially homeless for like a couple weeks. I had lost my job. Like I don't have anything, right?
I
And
feel
it
you,
was
man. I've
like,
been there in different
yeah,
ways.
it's like when you're at that very bottom where like you don't think there's any more bottom to go to, is when you kind of start seeing things in a different way, right? And
Yeah, that's the point. Is when you reach that point, that's the point of where we need to open ourselves up to the grace of the cosmos and have that, because grace, in my opinion, is, 'cause there's a definition, but I think like if you want to get the meaty existentialism, the esotericism of it all, it's that sense of reverence with the humility to boot, right? And
absolutely.
and if you that's the linchpin, is once you hit that bottom, that is the closest you might have ever been to a true state of grace. If you are able to just focus on it and see what the moment has to offer. And like, man, there's been moments in my life where I've been just at the bottom, and I've had, just like realizations about myself that were not, they're just detrimental, realizing things about yourself that you wish you didn't have, or things that have, caused you pain and others pain, and just, having a moment of release where all of a sudden you finally are able to just sort of grasp it, and you're not able to take away, the things that you did because of those mind states, but you're, by fully allowing yourself to understand the ways that you've done wrong, it's like the truest way, and perhaps the only way to really correct it. In that Buddhist sense, if you have to uproot, you have to get to the literal roots of the weed and uproot it psychologically. You can't just chop it off. And yeah, I don't know. It's not an easy thing to do, but as long as you're doing it in the name of altruism, the betterment of yourself, for yourself and for others, then you shouldn't be afraid. The thing is, if you're trying to seek power, and you're just kind of, you have hedonism as a goal, that's the real, because there's no end to that. That is the bottomless pit. That's the problem, is that you'll never find an end to that. And I don't know, I guess it's not like you find an end to anything one way or the other, but there's something that brings us closer to a state of contentment, and something that brings us further. Like, when in doubt, just look at the observations, look at the empiricism of it all. One thing, even Crowley, the man who was like the master of the left-handed path, it didn't work out too well for him in the end.
I was gonna say, I never understood. So listen, if you're a Crowley fan, like I love reading about Crowley. I love learning about Crowley and seeing the things that he did and reading about him. But if you're like a Crowley follower, I don't get it, right? Because like all his experiments failed, right? And he was no better for it in the end either, right? It's not like he found some secret and was able to like achieve his inner peace, right? Or whatever you feel makes you successful, achieve immortality, or become super rich or whatever. Like, the dude was from a wealthy family, right? So he had money, right? So he can do whatever he wants because he's got a trust fund. Okay. Again, if you're a Crowley fan, my apologies, but that's the way it is. So he could do whatever he wanted whenever he wanted. And so what does he do? He plays with occult forces. How well did that turn out for him? Right? Like, maybe he manifested the Loch Ness monster. Like, that's about it. Right? Like, what else?
Right.
What else? You look at all these guys, right? That follow Crowley, like Parsons, right? Like, Parsons is super interesting. Like, I find Parsons way more interesting than Crowley.
Mm-hmm.
But like, where did that lead him? Nowhere, right? You look at guys like L. Ron Hubbard, right? Followed Crowley and then pissed off and went his own way, and found the Scientology. Well, like, where did that get him, right? Like, yeah, the dude made a ton of money, but then what, right? Like, what's he doing now?
Yeah, I mean,
I
aside
don't
from
know, because he's not around, right? He's dead. But like, what for what, right?
aside from the small mass that he was able to brainwash, I mean, he was just known as a charlatan and basically a douchebag like today. So that's at best what you get from a path like that, and at worst you crash and burn literally in one way or another.
For sure. Well, and there's an alchemical saying, and I can't remember who it is or the exact quote, but it's something like when your heart is still, it turns from mercury to silver, something like that, right? And that's such a like simple truth, right? Like, you don't need to be like in an alchemical like mastermind, right, or like some super wizard to understand that, right? Like, most people know what mercury is. Most people know what silver is, right? Maybe more people know what silver is than mercury. But like, you can understand the basic idea of it, right? Like, mercury is one of these things where like it can't take a shape, right? It's just at room temperature, it's a liquid. It's a metal, but it's a liquid, so it's pretty to look at. But like, it's so simple, right? Like, when your heart is still, it turns mercury into silver, right? Because both metals look very similar. They're both pretty shiny silver things. But like, it's not about the physical manifestation of it. Is kind of what lies beneath the surface, right? And beneath the surface is this more precious metal in silver. And I think that's why the metaphor works so well. Like, no one cares about mercury, right? Like, it's toxic. Like, what do you do with it? You put it in thermometers. Like, who cares? Right. But silver, like, you make jewelry, like, it's used in electronics. Like, there's a lot of uses for it. And therefore it's more valuable. So what do you want your personal being to be? Do you want to be this piece of crap metal? I mean, maybe you can make anti-grav devices, but like, we haven't figured that out yet, right? That's the conspiracy. But we know about silver, right? So isn't that what we should aim to achieve, right? And that's what Jung wants to do too. Jung doesn't want to be in this existential crisis. None of us do, right? But when you start seeing things in a particular way, whether like the way that you view them is actually correct or not is irrelevant, right? And I'm not gonna talk about anyone's beliefs, but like, if you think that like, what's that dude that talks to like the Virgin Mary in the woods with like UFOs? Like, if you think that like Mary and Jesus come to this guy, cool. Like, that's your manifestation of it, right? Like, more power to you. You understand that there's something more, right? Like, to me, that's what's more interesting.
Yeah, that's the metric with which they are gauging their existence at the moment.
Yeah, sure. Which is fine, because then you see that there's more to things around you than the things around you, right? The things around you are made of things that you have no idea how they work, right? And that's just kind of the magic of it. Like, who cares how it works, right? It just works. So let's find out how to make it make sense in the way that we live our reality, right? Because you still got to get up in the morning and what's the Buddhist thing? Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. Same thing, dude.
Amen.
Right? Like, it doesn't matter like how enlightened or super wizard you are. You still got to go to the bathroom, right? Everyone's got well, maybe not everyone. Everyone's got a toilet.
No, that's a thing, right? That's a whole conversation, the holographic universe and shit like that. I remember reading about those sentiments. I mean, shit, man, with rainbow body and the Buddhists and stuff, there's whole there might be some potential level to just sort of almost transcending the physical while you are still physical. I wouldn't trust anyone that says that they're doing that, though.
Yeah, no, for sure. You got to be real careful, because there's a lot of people just trying to make money and sell books,
Yeah.
But like, you can do this wherever, right? Like, the Taoists have this saying, Well, they're like, if you really want to find the Tao, you can find the Tao anywhere. You can find the Tao in the city. You can find the Tao in the woods. You can find the Tao being a king or a pauper. Like, it doesn't matter, right? The work is easy. The secret is simple. And if anyone told you about it, you would just laugh, right? And I think that's the problem. Like, all this stuff is so simple, right? We just make it overcomplicated. And when we find like the answer where you're like, aha, all of a sudden you're like, nope, that can't be it. That's too fucking easy, right? And so we try to like convolute our daily lives with more and more things to kind of get some extra meaning. But the thing is, like, there's no meaning to any of it. None of it fucking matters, right? And when you start to realize, you're just like, haha, like, there it is. There's the secret.
Yeah, and to some points on Jung's sort of personality and his legacy, and why it's so relevant. I wanted to just bring up sort of like his mindset, not just the subject matter and the experiences he had, but in my mind, it always added a level of I admire Jung all the more for being so scholastic while he was alive, because I think he understood the significance that his work had, that he was one of the only people, certainly on the scale and with the precision that he had, he was one of the only people doing this, and he knew that going too far into some sort of, even if he towed the line adequately, if he went too far in one direction, he would just simply become fodder because he was extreme, too extreme. And he didn't want to not only do that disservice to his own legacy, but I think he found, especially the further he got into his career, that this was really resonating with people and that this was becoming one of the several foundational schools of psychology. And he said, I can't undermine this. I need to let this exist as it is. And then towards the end of his life, the mindset, as it does, I would imagine, sort of grows on you, like, well, maybe I don't need to take everything with me to the grave. And maybe now that my career is over, I can talk about some of these things a little more, which is what he did. And then, allowing the final pieces of sort of his mystical persona to come out after his death. I think it just really speaks to the fact that if nothing else, you cannot say that Jung didn't do everything in his power to make sure that his what he stood for and represented was not abused. You get what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah. Again, like, this goes back to this like collective altruism thing that he kind of wanted to work through his methodology. He had this concept of like a new religion, and for some it's like a reworked, simplified Christianity because of all the Christian imagery in the books. I don't think that's it at all. It's kind of more of like a more holistic, like spiritual, and spiritual in quotes, to get rid of the connotations there, but like a more connected humanity, right? Again, going back to the shadow work, like, that's what he wanted. And so I think part of the reason for these things not coming out is like, the family was worried about it, but like maybe Jung didn't want it now at the same time, because he didn't see people at that time as maybe being ready for all this stuff, right? You hear people talk a lot about like the Great Awakening, this, that, and the other. That's not like a one-time event, right? Like,
right.
This is the problem. It's not like all of a sudden everyone's awake and enlightened and that fixes the world's problems. There's no like savior coming to save everybody, right? Like, you need to become your own savior. You fix your own shit. You fix the problems in your house, and that's how problems go away. Not by babysitting other people and demanding that they change their mind into your point of view. That's kind of one of the issues that he had with Freud and why they ended up growing apart. is that Freud was just kind of very set in his ways and this very like materialistic viewpoint of psychology. Whereas Jung, for him, it was something completely different and something, almost unexplainable. That's why it took 20 years to work through these black books, right? And because he wanted to help bring about this like new religion, he wasn't worried about the stuff coming out when he was around, right? Like maybe there was a little bit of fear. Matter of fact, I'm pretty sure there was some fear. There's some like really interesting anecdotal tales of like black book events kind of correlating to certain things in his life, right? So like when his youngest daughter kind of leaves the house, he's like starts doing all this like ghost conjuring because he's basically it's almost like doing a ritual of protection, right? Where like he knows the world is a messed up place and there's like bad people that can hurt my kids. So how do I deal with that? And instead of like being an overprotective parent and like making his kids stay at home, he like dives into these like ghost stories and deals with like demons and evil spirits, and tries to like befriend them and learn from them, in order to like get over like the real ghosts, right? Where he can be like okay with his kids leaving his house and being under his protection and going out and making their own lives, right? Because there's monsters out there, right? So instead of being overprotective, what does a parent do? The parent fights those monsters within the imaginal realm, right? And so they can kind of remove that neurosis, the trauma that they feel for themselves, because maybe they lived through it, right? Maybe when they left their parents' house, they had these traumatic experiences. And obviously, like as a parent, you don't want your kids to live through that. But again, like he recognizes that that's not their battle, right? Like that's in his mind, that's not in their mind. And so that's a monster he has to slay, not his kids. And I think like that kind of thing is what kind of encompasses this new religion, again, in quotes, where we can find a way to get rid of all our own personal fears, and not dictate them on somebody else, right? Not preach them onto somebody else. We as people should be allowed to determine for ourselves.
Yeah,
right?
I'm very libertarian in that sense, for sure.
I'm extremely libertarian, right? So for me, like, it's just let everyone do what they're going to do.
Yes.
Right? Do what thou shalt, right? Isn't that what your boy Crowley said?
Do what thou wilt. Yeah.
Do what thou wilt. Yeah, there you go. Maybe he was a libertarian.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I'm sure that there are some Crowley adherents that would that would hate to hear that, but I mean, you could probably make some parallels. But I think to build on what you just said there, as we start to round home plate with our conversation a little bit, the reason that Jung is so important, among other reasons we've discussed, is he wasn't saying, I have special access or special information. Check out this information. It is a map of his inner experience to say, and he gives these disclaimers as well, pretty explicitly, saying like, this is not a roadmap for you, but by reading about my journeys, you can potentially find the metrics with which to gauge your journey, and they'll be similar because we're dealing with the same human experience. We're dealing with the same archetypes, but we all have different access, readily available access to those archetypes and different relationships, and the path will be slightly different. So Jung sort of built in as a failsafe for anyone that really cares to truly understand it. Like, you cannot take this as gospel, because this isn't explicitly gospel. This is the new religion in quotations, meaning this is like it's the path of individuation. This is not it's self mythology. It's not a religion of the self. So that this is an issue for me too, is people are all like, in esotericism, you find people with a preoccupation with us being our own gods. And I think that is, while I get it, and I if you have that couched in your brain the right way, it's not really an issue. To me, it just seems so demiurgic and so egoic. Like, if we are our own gods, I guess it really depends on how you interpret the definition of God, is what it really boils down to. But
Sure.
that can become very problematic. And I think instead the goal is sort of, in that Buddhist state, we're getting closer to that ultimate oneness. And Jung did not want to, he didn't want the semantics to become the gospel. He wanted the practice and the tenacity and, the, if anything, the methodology to be the points.
Well, and that's how it always starts, right? Like, you get a prophet, right? Somebody comes in and starts saying certain things, and people take it for their word, right? They take it as a literal thing. This is what they said, and in 3 days that this guy's going to come back to life, right? But that's not what life everlasting is, right? That's not that wasn't the point of a figure like the Christ, right? Like, when Christ died, he had to go down to hell and fight demons, basically. And in essence becomes the Antichrist as a result, right? And the Antichrist isn't like an evil figure. It's just the literal thing, Antichrist, the opposite of a Christ. Because in order for the hero to achieve this enlightened state, they have to unite the good and the evil to be able to understand the fullness of, as the Gnostics say, the pleroma, right? Like all of God. And that's the only way to do it. And I think Jung was doing the same thing, man. He sees the failings of people and the dangers of following rhetoric and ideology. And so, he just kind of works it through himself to make himself better, in the hopes that as people read his work, they kind of follow a similar path in attaining their own individuation.
Yeah, amen to that, man. I think as a little cherry on top, it's good, if you haven't picked up by now, like, this is sort of apex material in terms of, you can, especially if you feel like it, you can certainly just read this like with a cold start, just right out the gate, but you're certainly not going to understand it all. And even as you immerse yourself more in symbolism and esoteric study in these things, you're not going to understand it all. It's just one of those things that was, like you said, Martin, this was like 20 years of time, and even more once you count the editing and all the paintings and things like that, and the calligraphy. And this was a life's work. And these things, that is why it's daunting and why it's so dense. But so take it, respect the material, but also don't be intimidated, because it's the layers of the onion. It's one of those things where every time you read it, you get a little bit more, you have a slightly different perspective, and that's just sort of the beauty of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think if you really want to appreciate it beyond just like how beautiful it is, go read the Red Book, and then once you have the Red Book under your belt, then dive into the Black Books.
Well said. Yeah, and the things that you talked about in the end there, I know Jung had a fascination with trying to understand Yahweh as the antinomy that he is presented as, sort of the embodiment of opposites, which is a simple definition to put across, but fleshing that out and like the existential implications of that is pretty daunting. And we've kind of had those conversations before in some ways, so we'll just leave that as kind of a tie-in there. But
yeah, sure.
Would you have anything as final comments? Because since I kind of brought it up, I do want to hear what you have to say. What do you think about God? Just as cherry on top for people. We've talked about spirituality and the investigation and the pursuit of divinity. So what do you think about quote unquote God, and especially in relation to Jung's perspectives on God?
Oh, interesting. Okay. what are
Because
my thoughts on God? It's funny.
the
'cause
audience will understand. We're not trying to get on a pulpit here.
yeah, no, sure. It's funny that you say that because like I kind of felt the question coming, and then when you said the words, I smiled because I've had experiences in my life, and I keep a lot of that the details private, but because of those experiences, and this is now what 3 years later, and this is why I smiled. Like I got to a place in my life where I knew absolutely for sure that God exists. And 3 years later, as you ask me this question, I smile because I don't have to think about it. Like I still feel the same way. And it's not one of these things where like, I have to go to church every Sunday or Saturday or whenever people go to church. I don't have to do prayers or, sing my hallelujahs or whatever it is. I'm just content in the state that I'm in because I'm content with my connection with what I feel is God. And I hope folks listening are able to, if you haven't already, one day experience what that is. I'm getting a little teary-eyed just even talking about it, but it's a beautiful experience if you're able to achieve it. And again, just like you mentioned before, this is not like an advertisement for anything, right? Like I'm not selling a book. Like I'm not even doing the podcast right now, so I don't even care if you go listen.
Wait, Martin, aren't you about to release My Conversations with God, the official autobiography of Martin Ferretti?
I am not. I
No?
don't.
Okay.
I don't. No, and I don't go around, preaching my experience with God either, because that's a personal
no coffee
thing.
mugs with like your face on one side and like
No.
scripture on the other or anything.
No, absolutely not. The Tao of Martin. No, none of that. That's just from my personal experience. And
No, beautifully put, man. And I appreciate every bit of yourself that you have been able to share with us. And I completely agree. Like, amen to that. However you want to slice the pie, there's definitely some sort of cosmic divinity, however you want to put it. And I don't doubt it at all. And while it can't be articulated, and that's the whole point, and those who do try to fully articulate it, well, there's nothing wrong with trying, but once you say that and you're fully articulating it, that's sort of like the beginning of the end in terms of transparency and truthfulness. But I do think so much of it lies in grace and understanding the sort of dual nature of grace.
yeah, and before we started talking, you asked me like, "What's up with the podcast? Are you coming back?" And like, this is the reason that I'm not doing the podcast right now, because I'm so certain in what I just said that I don't want it to come off as like a preachy thing, right? So, in order to not do that, I'm just content in experiencing it. So there's the answer to your question 2 hours later.
Yeah, well, beautifully put. And I do think that echoes Jung's sentiments himself. And dare I say that I think that when you go about the process correctly, you come to these sorts of states of mind. And I also think that there's something, as the last thing I'll say, I think there's something beautiful in sharing your experiences with other people. And I think that some of those experiences, or at least some of the contexts, should be shared, but that doesn't mean everything should be shared. And I do think in some sense, some things are meant to be personal. And that's kind of part of it too. And it's sort of that like, that like prophetic, like burning bush type allegory where when you have certain epiphanies, existential epiphanies, spiritual awakenings, if you will, by their definition, not everyone is going to understand it. So shoving that down people's throats is going to be ineffective and just not get you anywhere. It's also not going to help you understand it any better. So
yeah, your whole life you're like searching for the ox, right? That's the Buddhist story. Your whole life you're searching for the ox, and then you find the ox, and you go hunt for the ox, and then all of a sudden you realize there is no ox, and you're all right.
Amen, man. Well, Martin Ferretti of the Alchemical Mind, thank you so much for joining me. You are a brother from another mother, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Anytime, man. Hey, we should do a magic spell. All listeners should go and give this podcast a 5-star review.
Yes. Yeah.
I got to bring this up real quick. I know we want to wrap up. But I was listening to your episode where you finally said, "Hey, let's get some reviews going," and I thought it was so fun. Like the whole time, I'm like, "Oh my god, Anthony's doing a magic spell." I just thought it was funny because
buddy,
you're giving 5 stars, right? So I'm thinking like the whole alchemical thing, the 5 elements and the star as being the shape of the Adamu, right? The cosmic man. And the orbit of Venus is shaped in this star symbol. You're doing 5 stars, right? So you're wearing the pentacle on your neck, right? I'm like, oh man, this is like perfect. So go give Anthony 5 pentacles around his neck, please.
Yes, please, and thank you very much. And actually, some of you went ahead and did that when I brought it up in the last couple episodes. So shout out and salute to those of you out there. Martin, thanks again for coming on, man. Happy holiday season to everyone listening. Go check out divemind.net, the Alchemical Mind podcast, and dive into Jung's Red Book and then eventually the Black Books. We both encourage it. All right, peace everybody. Thanks for listening. Y'all take care.
Falling on a deaf ear, dialing, calling down tones, no rest here. Time brings you in a standing, flourish your outer planning, ages wise, courage, dead fear. Raise the blind curtains, find certain stress clear, maintain through stress here. In the mind, lace Columbine, locked in brain cells, I paint hell, paint heaven, spray can, bass yelling, open hands, empty to the eye's face, empty hand is full of thy face. Let energies move like nature did, fire in the sky, you can taste the wind, hanging off of dead coins and change, noise through veins, core of the sun strums the rays. I spit my hunger pains, still on the plantation with a wick to blaze. Water can't slide in the fire that's raised in a bunker chained. This out of sanity, omit vicious insanity. I'm neither, receive my word like a believer.
I've been on my grind for eons, right? Way before your sleepless cities and your neon nights. I was beyond light within the ether. Then I brought you peons light and lit the world. Inspire visions beyond sight. My third eye trace the star maps. I'll be home soon. Drop shrooms, lace a tune with the man in the moon. Beyond the consciousness, there to consume. Panic ensues when my words prove the legends of Atlantis was true. I see devils, make it rain and raise the sea levels. 100 feet of water flood the streets where the beast heckles. Peace settles, never last. Heaven we never have. This life an endless struggle, war within the better half. Don't try to run, I'm a sniper bullet wrapped inside a drum. When you nod your head, you're dead. Your soul will burn inside the sun. Forever cursed to be pathetic. Never drop a clever verse, never find the words to say. Walk the earth on endless search. Your wordplay worthless. Your life has no purpose beneath the surface. The real art, defeat the serpents, escape the globe. Ignite our mics and burn the fat away. Stay killing all the week off from Saturday to Saturday.
Touched by heavenly force, my essence strained from the pain of darkness. My intervention for my soul to get clean, withdraw from the sickness. Burn the 3rd degrees, breaking the veil from these visions I see. My intuitions bleed, taking steps to conquer. This quiet monster inside that provides the vibe. For this death to get stronger, I pray to the most. So trotting through this barren plain, trials and tribulations in my crosshairs. Observe as I aim, sometimes it's hard to figure the equation. Live from scene house, my situation is an absurd type verb that's only spoken to the mouths of sages. Translated through hieroglyphic braille to relay what's real. Asphyxiate my struggle never. It's the torn muscles that build a stronger frame and the discipline. Stop the rain, time to manifest illusions. Deep inside my brain, my peanut